Okay, welcome back from the coffee break. It's time for one last talk from me, and I hope you will forgive me. But I'd like to change the topic just a little from what you saw in the schedule, sort of based on some questions that I got and some things people seem to be interested in, and that I didn't have time to talk about earlier, right? So I'm happy to talk about concise planning and constrained communication. Gave you just a preview of the concise planning work in the previous talk. And the constrained communication is newer stuff, but it has kind of, in a way, some similar flavors to what you saw in the last talk. So instead of presenting those things, I would like to talk about navigation planning for unreliable robots, which you recall maybe I had promised to talk about earlier in the week, but didn't get to. So okay, so let me give you just a reminder. So earlier in the week we saw this algorithm for localizing a robot, right? So in this case the robot has a compass and a contact sensor. It's able to choose a direction and then move in that direction as far as it wants. Well, not as far as it wants, as far as it can, until it hits something and then it stops, right? And I described an algorithm that takes a polygon and generates a sequence of motions for the robot to execute, such that after executing those motions, regardless of any starting location, the robot ends up in the same final spot, right? So I know we saw this video before, but I just want to refresh your memory about the general flavor of that kind of work. And one very astute question that was asked was what happens if we use a more realistic model of how the robot can move around? So in particular, to get this algorithm to work, we need to generate some motions that essentially slide along the edges of the environment, right? So to do that properly, we need to make sure that the robot's motions are perfect, right? So that works fine on a whiteboard. You can get it to work fine in your code if you implement these algorithms, but if you have a physical robot, that's not going to work out, right? To summarize, when we're working with a physical robot, nothing ever works properly, right? Any kind of measurement or measured motion that we might try to make is going to have some errors associated with it, right? So we knew that was an issue when we were even thinking about these problems to begin with. And we thought, well, this problem looks hard enough, even with these assumptions that everything works out perfectly. So we tried to solve it under these perfect assumptions. And after we had some success with that, we decided to rewind and see what would happen if we had some more realistic models of how robots move. So that's what I want to talk about today. We'll change things up just a little bit. So rather than thinking about a localization problem, I want to talk about mobile robot navigation. Right? And some of these same ideas could apply to localization, but in a sense, this is a trickier problem. So here's the problem I'd like to solve. So the input is again a polygon. And in some cases in the past, we've assumed a simple polygon. For today, holes are okay. Right? It doesn't matter if there are holes or not. It does not necessarily need to be rectilinear, just arbitrary polygon with holes, whatever you like. So we get that as a description of our environment. And we'll use a robot model that's very similar to the one that you saw in the video just a second ago. Right? So we've still got this capability for the robot to drive forward until it hits something. And we're still not measuring any distances. We still can't see the obstacles ahead of time. None of those kinds of things, right? So that all is the same. But now we'd like to relax this idea that we can aim exactly in the direction that we like. So instead of saying we'll face precisely in the direction that we command the robot, let's suppose we have an error bound, right? So rather than facing exactly north, we will get sort of plus or minus some error bound, right? And we don't know where the robot's orientation will be within that range, but for this model, we'll assume that it is within that error bound, right? So this is actually a lot more reasonable. And if there's time, I can even show you some robots that are actually moving around in this way, right? Okay, so there's our problem. Given a polygon describing our environment and a start and goal location at vertices in that environment, can we generate a sequence of these kinds of motions to guarantee that we can get arbitrarily close to the goal, right? And I guess that little bit about arbitrarily close turns out to be important, right? Since there's some errors here, we can never be totally sure that we've reached the goal. But I'll show you how to drive the maximum distance from the goal as low as we can, right? Okay, so let me preface this by saying we have not fully solved this problem, right? So there's some fruit left to be harvested from this tree, but we have made some progress on it, and I will show you where the limits are when we get toward the end. Okay, so that's what we want to do. That's what we want to do. Let me just motivate this just a little bit so that you can see, get some intuition for why this is hard. So here's a navigation problem that our robot might like to solve. And if our robot has no errors, then everything works great, right? We can generate a sequence of moves that gets us from start to goal. And this looks beautiful, right? No problems. It's very easy to generate these things. But if we have some non-trivial errors here, so here's the same plan being executed by several different copies of the same robot using sort of randomly sampled errors, right? And you'll see that well, actually, it looks for a moment like almost all of the robots fail to reach the goal. The truth is that the probability of robots reaching the goal with these randomly sampled errors is actually very, very small. The only reason this one is succeeding, is that we picked one where the error would be held to 0, right? So everybody else is failing over here in a fairly spectacular way, right? It's not that we will miss the goal by a little bit. It's that we're not even getting close, right? So this should give you some idea that we need to think about algorithms that account for the error at the beginning, right? There's not really very much hope of generating a path for a perfect robot and then repairing it afterwards, right? Okay, so you guys see the bad news here, right? In fact, at a glance, it's not even clear that we have much of a chance at all of solving this kind of problem, right? So let me give you at least a little intuition for how this how we might have some hope of solving this. Right? So here's a tiny little slice of the environment, and we'll suppose we know the robot is at S up there in that corner, and let's imagine that this vertex A of the environment is our goal. Right? So we want to get from S to A, and we have two edges of our environment boundary here, A, B, and AC. Right? So here's our idea. We want to pick some point X along the segment from A to B. I'm not telling you yet how to choose X, or X1, I guess. And so we'll see the algorithm for picking an X1 in just a second. But the idea is you aim our robot for some point along this boundary. So after that step, of course, we can't guarantee we'll reach X1, right? Instead, we'll have some cone that shows us the possibilities, right? So maybe the robot will end up over here, maybe the robot ends up over here, or anywhere in between, right? So you can sort of draw a line segment that represents the possible results of that movement. Right? But after one step, we know we're somewhere along the segment AB, right? And just as an aside, this assumption that we know which segment the robot is touching at all times is a fairly strong assumption, and is actually one of the biggest weaknesses of the approach I'm describing. So we'll come back to that a bit later. Right? Okay, so we do one motion from S towards some X1 that we pick, and we may not get to X1, but we'll at least get to this segment. Then from there, we make another motion. So we're somewhere along here. And the idea is to take the direction from A to B and rotate by our error bound up, right? So specifically, we want to go out far enough to guarantee that if we move generally toward A again, that we're not going to collide with this segment AB immediately, right? So if we choose anything less than this theta max, then there'll be some error values that'll point inward toward the segment AB, and then when we drive that way, our contact sensor triggers immediately, and we don't make any progress, right? So this is sort of necessary and sufficient for making some progress. Right? So from some point in the vicinity of x1, we make another movement in this direction, right? So we'll reach over here, segment from A to C. We'll reach x2, and of course, we don't know where we are here, right? But I guess the key thing that you might notice is that depending on how the angles work out, it's actually quite possible that our interval of possibilities here at x2 is smaller than we had at x1, right? Then from there, the process repeats. So we take the direction from A to C, rotate out by our error bound, and aim for x3, right? And so we'll get an even smaller segment. Then we iterate here, right? So x4 is even closer, and it's not shown here, but x5 is even closer, and it sort of gradually bounces back and forth between these two segments, getting us as close to A as we care to get, right? So we'll call this procedure a corner finding procedure, right? And right, the intuition is that by using these back and forth kinds of motions, we can gradually guarantee to get as close to A as we want. And in fact, I'm using the word gradually here in a way that's probably not accurate. It's actually very, very fast. Right, so you can kind of see the argument for why this works. You end up with similar triangles here, right? So the triangle formed by x1, x2, and A is similar to the triangle formed by x2, x3, and A, and so on, right? So there's a scaling factor that remains constant. So very quickly, we converge down to A. Right. Is the idea clear?
Sorry, whatever our error rate is there always a path to our goal? I mean,
No. In fact, it's fairly easy to construct examples where there's no way to guarantee. Right? So what I would love to have is a complete algorithm where if there's a solution, our algorithm finds it and outputs it very rapidly. Right? We don't have that yet. Oh, and by the way, if there's not a solution, our algorithm can tell us that, and then we just stop. Right? So what I can give you is an algorithm that if it finds a solution, you know it's correct. If we can't find a solution, then we can't make any promise that we didn't miss one. Right? But of course, if there's no solution, we shouldn't feel too bad about not finding it, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other questions about this much so far?
The corner should have degree less than 90 degrees.
It depends. So I'll give you an exact bound on how big the corner can be, but there is kind of a maximum. In some cases, you can still make progress even if it's greater than 90 degrees. So that, I think, is my next slide. So just hold that question for just a second. Good one, though. Anything else? Right. So already, to me, this is already kind of an interesting result because we have just a sequence of motions, right? We don't have any sensing. We don't have any feedback saying, "Aha, we figured out that we're here." And even with potentially large errors, right? When we try this thing out in experiments, we usually use, let's say, 5 or 10 degrees, right? Which is by robotic standards very large, right? If you can make a 10-degree error on every rotation you make, that's really bad. And even in those cases, we can still kind of converge to A very, very quickly. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like. All right, so this is just kind of a toy example. The robot there is washed out a bit, but this is not quite a Roomba vacuum cleaner, but from the same company, just with the vacuum part removed. And you can see we have to do a little bit of work here to align the robot with the edge. Happens because this robot doesn't have a compass, so instead it's using a sensor that measures the wall next to it to make sure to get lined up. And admittedly, it's not very exciting to see a Roomba rotating around and around in a corner, cramming itself there. Key thing I'm hoping you get from this is that this is This is not a theoretical trick, right? We can actually do this. Okay, so that's the idea. The question is, can we figure out the proper conditions under which this corner finding will actually work? And as promised, there's the bound there. So it turns out there's three things we need to check to confirm that this approach will get us from S to A, right? Because part of the problem is that in principle, this is sort of an infinite sequence of motions, right? So making sure that infinite sequence of motions won't collide with any of the wrong obstacles and end up in a place we don't want is tricky, especially when there's these error terms that can be different at each step, right? So we need to be very careful about checking to make sure this will succeed properly. Okay, so the first condition is the angle can't be too big, right? And basically what you need to do here is solve for the value of that angle at A that gives you the possibility to just bounce back and forth between the same 2 points, right? Then as you make it narrower, you make progress faster, right? So if we have an angle bigger than pi minus 4 theta max, then it actually diverges instead of converging. So that's kind of bad news. And of course, smaller angles will give us faster conversion, right? But depending on the value of our error, we do this even if it's much bigger than 90 degrees. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing we need to make sure is that, the first transition is guaranteed to be collision-free, right? And I'm using the word guaranteed here because we don't know exactly where the robot will be moving in that first transition, right? So it could be a little bit further this way, it could be a little bit further that way, right? So we need to check that whole entire cone, right? To make sure that's clear. So we need to check that. We also need to check and make sure that the second transition is guaranteed to be collision-free, right? So again, we get sort of a triangle that represents places the robot could move through in its second transition. We need to check and make sure there's no other obstacles within there, right? If there are, then it's possible the robot could hit them and not end up at A, and instead get stuck on those obstacles, right? We can actually prove that if these three conditions hold, then doing the strategy will allow the robot to travel safely using this method from S to A, right? Okay, so given that, the proof of this is actually not too hard. The main thing to notice here, okay, so we need to check this first transition. Okay, that's great. The second transition we check. So this entire triangle containing x1, x2, and A. We make sure there's no obstacles in there other than these two segments we're dealing with explicitly. The thing you'll notice is that everything else stays within that triangle, right? Regardless of any error values we get, we never leave that triangle again. So if we confirm that this is collision-free, then the rest of the path is going to be perfectly safe. Okay, so that's the very simple idea behind that proof. So given this, remember we still have a choice for what point we use for x1. All right, we haven't decided where the robot should aim for that first movement from S to x1. And actually, our answer is just to do an exhaustive search, right? We want to find the set of all motion directions starting from S that will guarantee that these conditions actually work out, right? So here's an example. And this one, unlike the previous one, actually has some obstacles that we need to be careful about, right? Okay, so the first step is let's figure out which motion directions from S can guarantee that we'll reach the segment AB safely, right? So here there's an obstacle. So anything that might take us, sort of into this region, we need to avoid those places, right? So I guess this feels like actually a very simple sort of computational geometry homework sort of problem. So we sweep a cone around S, and any time that the leading or trailing edges of that cone is within angle theta max of any obstacle, then we eliminate that segment, right? So we can compute that red region representing places where the first transition is guaranteed to be collision free, right? There's sort of duals here, right? We can talk about choices for x1, which I'm showing you in red. But of course, each one of those corresponds to an angle that we might choose as the motion angle from S, right? Okay, so we can compute all of those. We also need to make sure that second transition is collision free. So to do that, we imagine a triangle with the right shape, sort of growing from A outward, right? And so we've got these. So we've got a ray, and that's actually rotated 2 times theta max from the segment AB. 2 times because remember the action we're going to choose here is going to be based on the error bound, right? So that's showing us a dotted line, but the motion of the robot may be actually a little bit more than that. So you need to consider those possibilities as well, right? So we grow that triangle out until it touches one of those vertices. So we find the interval that catches those. And notice that's always going to have A as one of its endpoints, right? So we've got this region where the first action is safe, this region where the second action is safe, and we just intersect those two. Right? So that tells us the places we can aim for from S to guarantee that we can reach A using this process. Right? So it's there's a lot of from my perspective, a lot of details to be careful about, but in the end the idea is actually very simple. Right? Okay, and then I guess the important thing is that the specific width there is not terribly important, but the fact that it's non-empty is. Right? So if you want to choose an x1, well, just pick anything in that resulting region. Doesn't matter. Right? We've shown that the robot will reach the goal from any of those. And there's no particular reason to prefer one over the other. Right? Okay, so this gives us a technique for at least in some cases, traveling reliably from one vertex to another one, right? And given a pair of vertices, we can test whether or not that transition is possible. And of course, once we know we're at A, we can let A be our new S and then continue from there. So maybe you can guess where the algorithm starts to go from there. Of course, we form a graph over these things, right? So we get a graph where the vertices, or the nodes of the graph, correspond to convex environment vertices. Right? So something like this, and right. So we get all those, and then anytime this pre-image computation gives us a non-empty pre-image. Anytime there is at least one spot we can choose for our x1, we draw an edge between those two. So in this example, it looks like this. And I kind of faded out the environment just to emphasize the fact that we're drawing straight lines here that correspond to perhaps several motions of the robot, right? Okay, so this gives us at least a algorithm for solving. Well, solving is a strong word, but at least trying to generate some paths for these kinds of problems. Right? So you can imagine how it goes, right? You take your starting point and find its node in the graph. Take your destination point and find its node in the graph. And this one is directed, so you need to find a directed path from start to goal. And once you've got that, then you can expand each one of those edges into the sequence of corner finding motions that gets you there, right? Okay, so this part clear? Right. Okay, so that's some partially good news. There's also some bad news. So this works in some cases. There are certain kinds of environment features that this approach is actually really bad at solving. And one of them that I'll call your attention to right away is right here. And so we get this kind of T-junction. You'll notice that with the tools I've described so far, really the only way to, let's say, to get into that T-junction, to go from here down to here, we need to sort of make that jump in just one step, right? So we would hope for a clear path to maybe hit this one, or as you can see, there's not much hope to make sort of this L-shaped motion that you get from the corner finding algorithm, right? So T-junctions turn out to be a problem. The other thing that's tricky is something like this along the bottom, where there's a very long hallway, right? So in a situation like this where it's a very long hallway, for example, right, so starting from here, we might not have very much hope of getting all the way across, right? So it depends you can sort of very easily use some visibility to compute the maximum angle, the maximum error angle that you could use to get from here to here, right? So, at some point the hall is just too long and too narrow to actually traverse it using this kind of approach, right? So, so that's a bit of bad news, right? One idea we could try though is to think about a bigger graph, right? So. Right? So one feature of the algorithm I've described so far is the idea that at the end of every discrete step, at the end of every transition on this graph that I'm describing, the robot knows exactly where it is. Right? So we're at some vertex, and we do this corner finding motion, and then after that's done, we know we're at some other vertex. Right? And there's no sense in which the robot may have some uncertainty about where it is for a little while, but then we know that we can find another corner later to relocalize ourselves. Right? So we would like to think about how can we expand our graph to be able to account for those kinds of we call them temporary uncertainties. Right? Some steps through the graph that correspond not to a known position at a convex corner, but some interval of possible positions. And we're not quite sure exactly where the robot is. Right? Okay, so so we would like to, so keep everything in the graph that we've got so far, keep that in place. But let's add some new nodes that we'll call interval nodes. Right? So for each interval node, rather than having just one point, let's draw a segment. And of course, it's not obvious where to draw those segments. But for a basic starting point, we could imagine, you've seen it already, right? The idea of visibility actually seems fairly important for keeping track of where the robot can go. Except that there's some errors here, right? So rather than using, sort of the classic visibility rays, which are parallel to the environment edges, we rotate them outward just a little bit. So it's a little bit fatter than the usual thing. And you can see here these yellow circles corresponding to the locations where we get these. Right, and then so that gives us for each edge of our environment, a set of positions along that environment, and then we do sort of O of n squared partition. Right, so every interval whose endpoints are one of these endpoints that we've generated with this visibility projection, we include as an interval node in our graph. Right? So there's a lot of them there. Okay, so what can we do with those things? Right? Why is it valuable to think about these kinds of interval nodes? Well, I guess the point is that we can. After adding those nodes to our graph, we can start to try and find edges that connect them in. Right? So we have the same idea that an edge in the graph means that we can move reliably from one node to the other. But now instead of just these point nodes that we had before, we also have the possibility of some intervals. Right? And there's lots of different kinds of transitions we could try to make at that point. Right? So one very simple one is, can we make a transition from a point node to an interval node? And of course, we can do that as long as the triangle formed by those two objects is empty, right? And the same kind of thing, right? We can jump from one interval node to another by testing whether that trapezoid is empty. And of course, we can go in reverse, right? All of these kinds of things work out the way you'd expect them to, and I will leave the details of how that geometry works out, as it's nothing exciting happens essentially, right? So we generate this collection of sort of very small, almost call them local planners or connection tests, right? One thing that was somewhat surprising that turned out to be useful was that it actually turned out to be valuable to imagine connections between interval nodes that took 2 steps instead of 1, right? So essentially, that's shown in green here. Can I get from here to the green one on the top in 2 steps? Right. So this one, in fact, is not a node of our graph, right? And instead, the edge from here to there is labeled with those 2 actions that do that. Right? So you can kind of essentially do the math to find these kinds of things. Okay. Is it clear so far? Okay, a couple of nods, blank stares. I guess this has been a long week, right? Everybody's ready for a break. Okay, let me mention one other thing that that turned out to be kind of useful here. So we saw this problem with long corridors, right? So one thing we could try, for example, is starting from one known point at the end of the corridor. If we make one motion, we might get something like this, and so it gets a little bigger. And we we argue that there was some trouble trying to navigate long corridors, right? But it turns out that if we have these interval nodes in the right places, then we can make some progress down the corridor. Right, so here in 2 steps, it gets a little wider, and on a 3rd step, it's a little wider still, right? And we can do this kind of bouncing back and forth motion, where our uncertainty gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? But here's the good news, right? If we have the right kind of structure at the end of the corridor, for example, if we have this convex vertex here, then we can do the corner finding that we used before, right? So these interval nodes allow us to traverse these kinds of structures where it's impossible to keep track of where the robot is all along the way. And as long as we have, you can think of this as a geometric landmark, right? As long as we have some spot we can use to localize the robot when we're all the way done, then it's okay, right? We don't mind being confused about where we are as we move down the hallway, as long as we can be sure to get everything back to normal when we get to the end, right? So this actually turns out to have a very, very strong effect on on how much we can do here. Okay, so let me show you an example. How much time is left? Oh, I've lost track of the time. Okay, so here's what it looks like when the algorithm is actually running here. So in this case, we want to get from that circle shown in red all the way around to the other side. So we'd like to search through this graph. Turns out the graph is actually very big, right? You recall that when I added those interval nodes, there ended up being something like n cubed interval nodes, right? So it's not exactly practical to build the entire graph. That's okay, right? We can search this incrementally, right? Just starting from the beginning and moving forward. And what you see here in blue and yellow, I think. Okay. So in yellow are the places that the algorithm has figured out how to reach already. Then in blue and green are the nodes that are trying to be connected, right? So happen to have paused it here at a spot where it's connecting a point node to an interval node over here. I suspect that connection will not succeed, right? But it's got to try all of these things, and you can see that. We use a priority queue and take a guess at which pairs are more likely to be useful, and we push forward, trying to find that path all the way around. So you can see here, here's that sort of T-junction that I suggested might be trouble for this algorithm, and based on the amount of time it spends trying to get through, I think you'll agree. Right, and eventually, hopefully, fairly soon, it will find that connection it needs to get through. Sometimes. Okay, let me point out here that the algorithm is not actually this slow. Right, so we captured a few frames for each iteration of the algorithm to make sure you can see what's happening here, and Any minute now, it'll find that one connection it needs to make to jump through. Right? Okay, there we are. And then the rest goes through fairly quickly. Right? It knows how to reach this one, and then it's doing some of this kind of long hallway sort of thing to reach the end. Okay, so that's what it looks like to plan the path. Here's the solution that we get from the whole thing. So you can see it's sort of alternating between these motions where the uncertainty grows, and then every once in a while it finds a convex corner. And when we see a convex corner that is, well, at least one that doesn't have any obstacles in the way and it's not too wide, then we can use that to relocalize the robot. Right? So you're seeing a lot of kind of sampled paths here. The algorithm actually doesn't use any random sampling at all to generate it. But again, I want to kind of illustrate how this kind of worst case reasoning enables us to guarantee that we can reach the goal that we want to. Right? Let's kind of take a look at it here one more time. Right? So you can see perhaps some parallels here to sort of classical approaches for mobile robot navigation, where in general you're looking for landmarks. Right? So some kind of landmark you recognize and you know which location that is. And then based on that, you can get a good idea of where you are. Right? In this case, those convex corners represent an impromptu landmark that the robot can use to localize itself, but in this kind of geometric way, rather than using vision or any of those other kinds of things. Okay, let me show you one more example. Okay, so here's a much larger environment. And again, the robot is starting over here, and we want to traverse all the way around here, right? And the reason I think this example is interesting is that at this point, the distances to travel are large enough that without some good techniques for helping the robot to keep track of where it is, unless we have some kind of good localization algorithm and sensors to support that algorithm, without that, we've got no chance here, right? Even for robots that have relatively small error bounds, it would still be very challenging to navigate that entire distance. In fact, not challenging, it'd be impossible to do that. Right? Because those errors accumulate over time. Right? The longer the robot drives, the less and less certain it can be about where it is. Right? Turns out using this approach, actually almost straight through, the algorithm is able to find a path. It's doing some things that may not directly make sense. So perhaps we could have jumped directly from here to here. Right? We're really not optimizing those kinds of things. But it's able to navigate across this sort of large-scale environment, and we're able to do it very quickly, right? And we're able to do it reliably in a way that where we can promise, as long as the robot obeys the model that we've given you, we can be sure that we'll get to the destination in the end, right?
So that's because there are more convex nodes that actually the robot have more chance.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's right. So convex nodes are certainly helpful, right? I'm not sure if they are strictly necessary, but every convex node is an opportunity to reduce the uncertainty that's grown down to a single point.
You made that graph with convex node, didn't you?
What's that?
The first graph.
Yes.
The nodes were the convex nodes.
Yes, that's right. If I didn't say that, then I ought to have. We could include the reflex vertices there as well, but we don't have any algorithm for reaching them. So they would be isolated vertices in that graph.
There was I had a problem with your, not this example, the example before this one.
Okay.
I didn't understand how the robots get rid of the leftmost egg. Actually, if you can show me.
Sorry, I'm not sure which one.
The example that you showed us before this one.
Oh, okay, so the smaller one, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, what am I doing? This one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly here, this
This one.
Yes. The algorithm first tried to achieve the leftmost edge.
Oh, yes, yes.
And then he tried this one.
Yeah, that's right, that's
Why
right.
he tried this one? Because both of these vertices are not convex.
Oh, I see, I see.
So
Yeah.
there aren't easily graphs.
Oh, I see, I see. So in fact, the edge or the vertex that it's aiming for here is not a point, but it's an interval, right? So there's, it's approximately sort of this shape from here to here, right? And we don't want to say, let's guarantee that we reach that reflex vertex, because that'd be a bad idea. I mean, we couldn't achieve that anyway. But so there's some interval along that edge, and the plan guarantees that the robot will reach somewhere in that interval. We don't know where, but somewhere in there. Then we continue from there, right? So this one is over here. It's the same thing, right? There's an interval of possibilities, right? Yeah. And we compute those intervals kind of based on the error to guarantee that from where we start we can get there in spite of the errors. Right? Does that answer the question? Anything else I can say about this?
Your last demonstration, I'm not sure if you have the actual code here, but can you extend the error band a little bit so you can see what becomes of that?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I do have the code here, but of course it was written by the student Jeremy Lewis, who worked on these kinds of things. So I'm not sure I know how to operate it. We can at least speculate.
Do you support open source?
What's that?
Do you support open source?
Of course, of course. Yeah, send me some email. Yeah, so in this case, you can see the errors are a little smaller here, right? I suspect that Jeremy picked the biggest error value that he could to get a solution fairly quickly here, right? Which is not quite the same as saying he picked the biggest error value he could for which this is solvable, right? Actually, one very natural question you could pose here, and this actually doesn't show up in the papers, but is in Jeremy's thesis where he describes these things. So here's the clearest place to illustrate it is here, right? So we form this graph, and I've described it just as kind of a general directed graph. It's actually not too hard to extend this approach to make this a weighted graph, right? Where the weights correspond to the maximum value of the error bound for which that edge would exist. Right? So I'm describing it here for a fixed error bound, but instead we could find the maximum error bound where that works. Right? So I think you can kind of imagine how that would work out. So then, given that kind of graph, instead of finding a shortest path, we might want to find the path that minimizes the maximum weight we traverse. Right? So actually, David talked about these kinds of like bottleneck trees earlier this week. Right? So we have in fact done that for the original version where all the vertices are points. Jeremy graduated before he had time to extend it to the full version, but you can kind of try these kinds of things, and it works the way you'd expect, right? Where you can, depending on the environment, you can get in some cases larger error bounds than others. For this specific example, I'm not sure what the largest error we can tolerate and still solve the problem is. If I had to guess, probably not much bigger than what you saw there. Okay. Any other questions at this point? These are good questions. It's very nice. Okay, so, please, no, even better.
Please go to the next slide.
This one?
Actually, the bigger example.
Oh, okay. This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
For the rightmost corridor, if our error rate isn't so small,
Yes.
The robot cannot go through that until the end directly.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
So is it possible that it goes to a wrong wall and fall into the actually those holes?
Oh, I see. So you're referring to this hole here?
Yes.
Yeah. So could it go to the wrong wrong wall.
Because the robot moves like
Yes,
this.
yes, yeah. So there's an important distinction to keep in mind here between online and offline execution, right? So everything that this algorithm does is offline, right? So the robot may consider some motions that start here and get stuck in this corner, right? And maybe that's a good idea, maybe not, right? If you can guarantee to reach, say, this convex vertex from here, that's probably a good thing, right? But it won't be the case that as the robot is actually executing these things, that it finds itself surprised to be in this hole, right? Right. Every motion that is a part of the final plan that we generate is one that the robot's making on purpose, right? And we are using some worst case reasoning to guarantee that it's going to end up in the places that we want it to end up. Okay. Anything else I can say at this point? Okay. So there's actually just one more idea that I wanted to communicate. So I promised you some discussion of the limitations of this approach, right? And one very, very important limitation, and if we're thinking about getting toward a complete algorithm where if a solution exists, we can guarantee to find it. So this is a problem that would need to be overcome to reach that point. Okay, so in the top you can see a simple environment. This one has a hole, and the question is, can we navigate from the top to the bottom reliably, right? Right. So one thing that I will point out is, okay, so you can sort of see the error bound I have in mind here. It's about this much. One very, very interesting feature of this environment is that given that error bound, for our algorithm, our algorithm fails right away, right? And I hope you can see why. It's because there are no actions that the robot can take that where we have any guarantee about which edge we'll reach, right? So from that starting position, any action, any direction we choose, we'll have at least two different segments we could hit, right? So coming down this way, for example, maybe we end up here, somewhere along this segment. Maybe we end up somewhere along this segment. As we rotate around, we could be confused about whether we're on the left or the right, and so on, right? And the geometry is chosen in a way that guarantees that there are no safe actions we can take, right? No actions where we can reach a segment where we know, okay, we're at this segment, right? And you'll recall, of course, that everything I've described so far relies on that assumption, right? So to cast this problem as a search through a graph, we need to know which node in that graph we're on. All of our nodes correspond to just a single point or an interval along one segment, right? So that's bad news, right? Our algorithm, no matter how hard we try, no matter how carefully we draw these interval nodes, anything that looks like our algorithm is going to fail, even on something as simple as this, right? But of course, there does exist a solution that solves this problem, and you can see that in the top right. Basically, we want to alternate between these four actions, right? So there's a cycle of we kind of go this way, then the opposite, this way, and then this way, right? So right? Kind of back and forth, and this is what it looks like after doing one complete cycle of those four motions. And again, just sort of shown using some sampling, but if you work out the exact details, it really does converge this way. So, important thing to notice is that the endpoints of these different samples are in different spots, right? So, some of them may end up along this edge, some of them may end up along this edge, but you can show that if you iterate this process, regardless of the error values you get, you'll eventually get sort of arbitrarily close to this goal at the bottom, right? So this is at least from my perspective, a remarkable piece of bad news for the kind of approach I'm describing, right? If you want to go from the kind of algorithm I'm talking about to something like this, you've got to have some way of reasoning about motions of the robot where the uncertainty grows so big that we can't contain it even within one segment of the environment along the way, right? All right, so then you can start to imagine bigger and bigger graphs, and at some point you start to give up and say maybe there's another approach needed, and that's where we've got to. So if anybody has any ideas about how to tackle these kinds of problems, then I'm very curious to hear about it. Okay, let me actually that's all I have to say about those kinds of things. So are there any other questions I can answer about this general stuff? Yes, please. Okay, so the question is about how the robot measures its angle. Okay, so whether it's feedback or not depends on the level at which you're thinking about the problem. Right? So we do need some way of orienting the robot with respect to a global frame. Right? So, for example, if you have a compass sensor, then you can use feedback on that sensor to take your best shot at getting the right orientation, right? Within the air bounds we've got. So if you're thinking at that level, then the answer is yes. There's feedback on the robot's angle. If you're thinking one level higher, where the commands we can give are face this way, or face that way, or face that way, at that higher level there is no feedback, right? For the most part, for this algorithm, we're thinking at that higher level, right? So we're generating a sequence of motion commands. Face this way, go hit the wall. Face that way, go hit the wall. Face that way, go hit the wall. And maybe you need feedback to implement them, but we're generally thinking at that higher level, right? So you get a sequence rather than any kind of decision tree or feedback loop. Cool. Thanks. Any other questions? Sorry, I've lost track of time. Is it close to coffee time here? I don't know. Okay, please. Real-world version of a gap sensor. Of course. So it's difficult to build a gap sensor. I can actually show you a picture of the sensor that the inventors of the gap navigation tree used to implement their algorithm. You've seen it already, but I'll bring it back. So here it is. So I'm not sure if you recognize this kind of technology, but this is a Pioneer robot, sort of the classic workhorse mobile robot for research labs. And maybe you can see these two blue sensors stacked on top. Right? These are SICK laser rangefinders. Right? So and they needed two of them because it measures only 180 degrees. So they stacked them along one axis, facing in opposite directions. Right, so this is an unsatisfying answer for you, I think, because they're collecting so much more information about the world than the gap navigation tree needs. Right. Right. So the question is, why don't you use all that information? Right. Here's my answer. My answer is, if you have access to that information and good algorithms for using it, then of course, go crazy. Right. Right, so I don't think the point of these kinds of algorithms is to say, you know what, take all your expensive sensors, let's have a bonfire, and we're only going to build simple robots from now on. Right? What I do think the message is that if we can find algorithms that solve problems we care about using very small bits of information, then that tells us which sensors are important to include on our robot. Right. So for example, based on this gap navigation tree idea, that we saw that if we want to navigate along some shortest paths, we may not actually care about measuring distances very accurately. Right. So instead of investing our time trying to find a range sensor that has very, very precise measurements of distance, maybe instead we focus on trying to find a range sensor that has for which we can identify those gaps very clearly, right? So even depending on how good your computer vision is, maybe you can even try to catch those gaps using a camera, right? So there's I agree. There's a disconnect between sort of physical or real world sensors and the abstract sensors, but I think this kind of research tells us what kind of abstract sensors are important, and then we can figure out which real world sensors can provide that information, right? But it helps direct us in choosing those sensors. Again, a very long answer, and I hope that was an answer to the question you asked. Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
Is the probable gap between the angle we want our robot to be put in and the angle which is used in physical
Yes.
experiment? Is there a finite set of moves that we should consider for the position or other influence?
Oh, I see. So I've approached this problem thinking about a continuous action space. So any direction is in principle possible to be one we can choose. Right? Whether or not that's necessary, I'm not sure. Right? I hadn't considered those kinds of restrictions. Anything else? Please.
Can you explain more about that robot operating system you talked about first?
Okay, sure. So, I could talk about it for a long time. The basic idea is that for a long time, writing software for robots was very painful because you had to reinvent the wheel all the time. Maybe you could find one implementation of a certain algorithm you liked, another implementation of some other algorithm you liked, and then you had to spend a few days writing code to get them to talk to each other. Maybe you couldn't even find any code that did what you wanted it to, right? So the robot operating system is very good at kind of smoothing those things out, right? It provides, in summary, provides a lot of code that the people are sharing to avoid reinventing wheels. Provides a very nice way to get all that software to talk to each other. That's kind of the 30-second version. I can tell you more about it if you want. Okay. Any other questions? Well, if not, then let me take this last opportunity to say thanks again for inviting me to Iran. It's been a trip that I will remember for my entire life, and one that has many, many good memories for me. And I look forward to another chance to come back in the future. So thanks very much.